Um, and so I think you have to tread that line and work hard at those relationships, and it's not easy to do given the nature of professional differentiation and competing for funds and all those other things that go on in a university setting.
Very, very wise advice, actually. I think it's very important. One of the things that I heard a year ago when I attended my first NASPAA meeting was a sense of almost despair among public administration school deans, that basically, as one of them said, these days all we really need how to teach is government contracting and outsourcing. That basically government is shrinking not in terms of what it does, but how much it does itself, and that therefore the skill set is really changing in rather fundamental ways. Do you agree with that, or is that an overstatement?
I think that's probably true from all that I hear. It has, and it's one of the great currents of things that are transforming the nature of the public service, making it more difficult, indeed, to distinguish something which can be called the public service as distinguished from private enterprise and everything else. Yes, I mean, you really can't realistically teach people without taking recognition of this great blurring around the edges of the public service. But here I come back to my old patriotic admonition: keep in mind that conceptually, at least, there ought to be, if there is not, in fact, something called the public service and something called the public interest.
Well, thanks very much. I've learned a lot from our conversation. You've given us a great overview of the evolution of the field and the organization.
I've enjoyed this very much.
Now I'm going to turn a little more parochial for a second and ask Professor Henry to share his thoughts and his remembrances on the history of public administration here at the University of Virginia. What can you tell us about its ups and downs over the years?
Well, public administration, of course, was taught here at the University of Virginia long, long before I came, beginning in the 1920s with a rather fabulous character in the field named Roland Egger, who dominated not only that field, but a lot of the university from the 1920s through till the 1960s. But it was clearly taught as an aspect of political science. And in the beginning had a close symbiotic relationship with state and local government in Virginia. But in the after World War II, when political science began to feel heavily pressured to become more legitimate and scientific and academic, more purely academic, the teaching of public administration, I'm afraid at UVA as well as other places, became increasingly academic. And that became the rub in the 1960s when two or three of us, relatively newly arrived at UVA, most of us with some experience in government or in Washington think tanks and other things, sought to bring a new and more active approach to the teaching of public administration or public affairs. And in the late 60s, early 70s, got established a separate degree program, a master's in public administration, and got involved in a number of relationships with both the federal and the state government to bring government people here for training, to involve our faculty, and so on. And these things were developing some momentum in the early 1970s, leading to a proposal to establish a school of public affairs, which became very controversial and ultimately failed, which we can go into if you'd like.
Well, maybe we have just a few more minutes. If you could say a little bit to kind of bringing up the story to the point of the founding of the Batten School. What was the controversial character of the proposal? maybe it was uncontroversial to you, but why was it regarded as
Well,
controversial?
it was regarded
by
as controversial for several reasons. One, that it was that wasn't inherently substantive, but this was a period in which there was great concern in the university about growth and capping enrollment. So here was a proposal for a new thing.
I see.
Another problem was that there was no guarantee of new money, so to the established departments it looked like a zero-sum game. Right. But the principal objection came from essentially the senior members of the poli-sci or government department, who saw it as divisive and basically inappropriate. So it was strongly opposed. The President Edgar Shannon, who had smiled on the idea early on, had not much appetite for controversy, and ultimately the proposal was turned down.
Yeah. And then, of course, resurrected, but with an emphasis on public policy a few years back, but with the financial, what made it the non-zero sum situation with this generous gift from Frank Batten, which
yes.
problem. You know, it's very ironic that I was reading one of the founding documents of UVA, and that was the report to the commission that was established. We always see it as the Rockfish Gap meeting that decided where UVA would be.
I've heard of it. I don't think I ever read the document.
Well, it's a fascinating document, I think written largely by Jefferson, who chaired the commission that produced this report, which was ultimately submitted to the General Assembly. But once again, it just emphasized the need for useful knowledge, but in particular the idea that the University of Virginia would train people for the councils of government. It was entirely talking about, I mean, the one main purpose, I wouldn't say the only one, but one of the principal purposes was to train people who would be engaged in this umbrella term of public affairs. And so it's ironic that it's taken the University of Virginia so long to basically live up to these kind of twin instructions from our founder. One was to have useful knowledge, and in other words, applied knowledge in the area of the social sciences. And then secondly, specifically to train people for public affairs. But we've now done it.
Yeah, well, we go through these waves of history. I think in my time at UVA, in a kind of a macro sense, what was going on was the university was trying to transform itself from being an interesting regional institution to a national institution of first rank.
Right.
And at the time, that seemed to imply a greater emphasis on research, theory, academic knowledge of the first class, and a relative disinterest in practical knowledge or engagement in the here and now.
Well, thanks very much. I think that's all the time we have for today, but thanks so much.
I hope we can continue this conversation some other time.
And the history of UVA and this and other areas remains to be written, so there'll be much more to talk about in the years ahead. Thanks so much.
Bye.
So, thank you. Thank you all.